Hi, I'm August. Welcome to the show where we explore ideas in the future. My guest today is Anders Hjemdahl. I met Anders when he gave a presentation on how fractals were used in the film Interstellar, and it completely blew my mind. It was my first introduction to fractals. We've had many conversations since, and I learned something every time. Anders is a creative technologist. He has bold creative visions, and he combines them with a deep technological skill set. Today, we're going to focus on fractals, and I'm going to share with you some of the excitement that I discovered when I first heard Anders talk about them. Let's dig in. Anders, welcome to the show.
Thank you, August. I'm glad to be here.
So I want to start by giving the audience a baseline on what fractals are. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to read an excerpt from an essay you wrote, and then we're going to dive in with a more complete explanation. Fractals give rise to important philosophical questions about how we choose to explain, define, and view reality. Deceptively simple algorithms, fractals enable us to describe, view, and understand the world differently and more accurately, and for reasons still only partially understood. Hidden in these fractal algorithms are vast worlds of incredible infinite complexity and beauty, there for us to explore using computer graphics. The first 2D representation of the Mandelbrot Set was popularized in the mid-80s. Since then, many more fractals have been discovered, and just in recent years, after a concerted effort by programmers and mathematicians around the world, we are now able to explore three-dimensional fractal worlds. We're even able to combine many different fractals, producing unique infinite worlds of stunning complexity, previously unseen and truly otherworldly, yet firmly tied to the underlying multidimensional reality of the universe around us. So what you just described is something that really resonates with me, and it resonates with me more so having learned more about fractals. So for the audience who's first coming to fractals, what does that mean?
Well, fractals is a way of describing the world in a very different way than classical Euclidean geometry, which has been very, very useful. It has enabled us to build modern society. It has enabled us to build the cameras that we're shooting this show with. It's immensely useful. But it's not, Euclidean geometry cannot explain a lot of stuff in nature that has been overlooked and ignored just because of that. We're not able to describe a cloud. We haven't been able to describe how a mountain is shaped.
So we looked in the areas where we had the tools to explain it, and there's a whole other set of areas we just haven't been able to explore because we didn't have the tools.
Exactly, and tools are lenses on how we view the world. So we view the world differently depending on how we understand it, and the tools or the lenses that we choose to look at it. And for me, fractals are fascinating because they have a tendency to describe the world in a more accurate way, a more organic way, if you will.
For example?
And fractals are used for things like dynamic systems. You might have heard of chaos theory. Fractals are part of that. So they're used to describe things like dynamic systems like the pressure of fluids, dynamics of gases, the financial market, the shape of coastlines, the distribution of mass in the universe, the shape of our lungs and our nervous system. Things like that, which you cannot use straight lines and cones and circles to describe.
Right. So some of those, like the coastlines and our lungs, are very more graphic than financial systems. So just looking at that, those are fractal patterns?
Yeah, they are. So fractal patterns basically is a pattern that repeats itself or is self-similar. So the more you zoom in, the more detail you will find. If you look at the edge of a mathematics circle, you will find nothing new. You can zoom in for 1 million years, and we'll just see the same line repeating itself endlessly. Fractals are like the opposite of that. The more you zoom in, the more you will see. And the strange thing with fractals is, for some reason, and nobody really knows why that is, calculating fractals graphically produces these wild patterns that nobody had seen before the late 1970s when we got computers and were able to calculate it. Mathematicians knew that these shapes were there, but they weren't able to see them. Drawing curves, and they call it monster curves because they weren't shaped like normal curves. And they couldn't explain why they were there. And this was in the 1700s, and they were exploring, trying to describe more accurately things that they weren't able to describe.
Okay. Why don't we look at some, and we'll put some on the screen for people to see while we talk about them.
Yep.
So this is the Mandelbrot Set that sort of kicked off this whole wave of fractal exploration. What do we see here, and what happens as we drill into it?
What we see here is just like a circle, it's a mathematic object. It's just an object that is generated by an algorithm. Only with fractals, they behave very, very differently. If you zoom into this, you will find endless complexity, and you can zoom into it an infinite number of times. And you will see patterns that are, it doesn't look the same. It will start changing when you zoom in, and you will find different worlds embedded in here.
So they're similar and they echo each other, but they're not identical.
They're self-similar, but they're not self-repeating. So
Okay.
you will find stuff that looks vaguely the same, and then it starts changing once you zoom in, and you see
Okay.
different details,
Wow.
and you zoom into those, and it might lead you to something completely different
Within the same
within the same
fractal.
algorithm.
So this is a single fractal. On the left, we see the formula that generates the entire infinite fractal. Is that right? I mean, it almost seems inconceivable.
Yeah, that's the tricky part with it, because it really is such a simple algorithm.
Wow.
And it's been sitting there for thousands of years. And
Wow.
people have even known about it, but they haven't been able to see it.
And this is infinite. Like you can go endlessly into it or endlessly pull out of it.
Yeah, you can.
Wow.
So
So
some people have called it the thumbprint of God, which I think it's,
Okay, because it reveals something.
it reveals something.
We don't know exactly what.
No, we don't know, and that's part of the thing that attracts me to this and
But it's
fascinates
clearly
me.
not arbitrary.
Absolutely not. It has some sort of connection to the innermost workings of the universe.
And as just so the viewers know, as we're flipping through these different images at the moment, this is all the same set from the same formula. We're
Yeah.
showing drilled in views of the exact same fractal.
All of these vistas that you see are from the same fractal, different
Wow.
parts of it, just zooming in and exploring.
Extraordinary.
And also another fascinating aspect of this is when you zoom in and you go deep, and just a few mouse clicks, I mean, the basic shape that you see starts expanding once you zoom in, the part that your computer has in memory. And just clicking in a couple of times expands the size of it dramatically. So you zoom in 20, 25 times, it is as large as the solar system.
So these are incredibly different, yet they're part of the same fractal.
They're all generated by that same
By the
tiny
same
little
formula.
formula.
Fascinating. Yet they all have so they're infinitely complex, but they're also, to the human eye, there's an organization. They're easy to comprehend visually.
There is an organization. The problem is, or the question is, what is it?
What is the organization?
And we don't know. It just, for some reason, they resemble a lot of organization that we see in nature. For instance, you look at a sunflower and you will see similar shapes to this, self-repeating, getting smaller and smaller, not identical, but very similar. And if you look into the tiniest aspects of a sunflower, you go to the cellular level, you will see fractal patterns right there as well. And in the root systems of plants, you will also see fractal patterns. As computers got more powerful, we were able to explore other types of fractals as well, like three-dimensional fractals.
And these are all three-dimensional fractals we're looking at now.
These are all three-dimensional. And as you can see, there's a wide variety of shapes in there. And nobody really knows where these shapes come from. I mean, they look highly organized.
They look like actual objects. They look like science fiction environments.
I mean, they are three-dimensional objects. What we're looking at is parts of huge three-dimensional worlds.
Some of them look very specific. They look like objects, like buildings.
They look like there's some form of plan behind them, right?
Yeah, they look designed.
Yeah, they do. And that what
But
also
they're-
attracts me to them, trying to, there's this deep sense of purpose to them. And I don't know why that is, and nobody really knows why that is. But they're there for us to explore in this
But
simple
you
little
look at
algorithms.
these, and you know that there's something. It just seems inconceivable that there's not something. There's not some deliberation behind it. It just seems like that is what they are.
I think the deliberation that we're seeing, actually, this is my personal theory, and the theory of many other people as well, is that the deliberation and the order that we see to them actually has something to do with the underlying order of everything, like how the actual universe is organized on a very fundamental level. And fractals are just a representation of that. There are many other types of fractals than two-dimensional fractals. There are three-dimensional fractals, there are even four-dimensional fractals, and since they're mathematical objects, they can have any number of dimensions. And more fractals are being discovered all the time. And they all generate these weird patterns.
So to me, those are just mesmerizing and incredible. But they also, I feel like there has to be meaning to that. That cannot be arbitrary. So what do these mean? What do the fractals tell us?
Well, that's the big mystery, right? It's become increasingly clear that, that sense of order that we see in fractals, these patterns and these structures, it seems to be a purpose to them for some reason. And we're not exactly sure why fractals generate these patterns. We don't know that. Nobody knows that. But we can see that they resemble patterns in nature, and we can actually use them to describe nature in a more, in a better way than Euclidean geometry has been able to do. So we can understand stuff that we weren't able to understand before. And it also means that we start seeing the world differently. The world is not straight lines. The world is not cubes and cones and circles. The world is something different, something much more complicated. And that includes all levels of existence, basically.
Right, including human behavior. We try to form things, push things into their own lanes.
Yes.
But that's often futile, in fact, perhaps always futile.
Yeah. For instance, a good example of behavior is a flock of birds. You can use fractal mathematics to describe how a flock of birds actually behave, why they do not collide, how the patterns that they use, those are fractal patterns. And the movement of the air through which they move is also a fractal pattern. And fractals can be used to describe all of these things. And some even say that, for instance, Stephen Hawking, he said that the universe itself, all dimensions of its existence, which are multiple, is actually the wave, the crest of a fractal wave.
And if we
That's
don't
how we put it.
It's almost like if we don't see it, we're just seeing too small of a set. We don't see the bigger pattern because our perspective is too limited.
Exactly.
So it implies that there's this repetitive, self-similar pattern beyond our field of view. And by field of view, I mean our conscious awareness.
Yeah, I think you could say that fractals represent some of the hidden underlying structures of reality, basically, or what we choose to call reality, because that's a little arbitrary. Reality is what we see and how we decide to look at it.
Based on lots of assumptions.
Yeah. So we all live in different realities, but fractals seem to be part of how reality actually works.
And what do they imply about the reality beyond what we've formally assumed to be reality?
I think that they teach us that reality is not as simple as we thought. It's not as easy to define as we thought. And it also tells us or reinforces that there's a lot of beauty in things that it's very easy to overlook. The tiniest details, the tiniest parts of atoms can hold this infinite beauty. And it's been there for us to see
So if
for
you just drill
thousands
down
of years.
deeper. Though at some point you hit the atomic level.
Yeah.
Do you believe fractal design would continue beyond that?
Oh, definitely. Because, I mean, that's when
That's the nature of an infinite
when we hit the
construct.
subatomic level, then we entered the realm of chaos theory, which is all based on fractals. So the closer you get to the actual reality, the fabric of the world, if you will, the more fractals you will be dealing with. And that's unavoidable. That's just how mathematics work.
So this is both subatomic particle level and in the
general scheme of
intergalactic,
things.
cosmic outer reaches of space level.
I mean, the distribution of matter in the universe is a fractal pattern. That's fairly...
We know that? I mean...
Yeah, we do.
And how do we link it to a fractal pattern?
Let me rephrase. I think all of these these dynamic systems, these shapes in nature, the way that matter is distributed in the universe, they might not be fractals exactly, but there's something very similar to them at least. They might also be, a straight fractal pattern.
But they follow fractal behavior.
They definitely do. And they follow a fractal pattern that we haven't been able to actually look at before. I mean, this is very new. I mean, we've been using Euclidean geometry and classical ways of looking at the world for thousands of years.
So organized.
And this is, this started in the mid-'80s.
Right.
And they were discovered in the 1800s, but nobody could look at them. They didn't have computers. They were trying to draw them, using pen and paper.
Another example of just pure computational horsepower.
Yeah.
Opening up our eyes to things that were right in front of us and we just had no comprehension of.
And it was just a fluke. People had no idea that this was there. And this tiny little algorithm, nobody knew that. It was a shock to the people that have been researching it for a long time.
So we see the physical world around us mimicking what we're seeing in fractal mathematics. Is it possible there are metaphysical patterns that mimic this too, and it sort of opens? I mean, there are theories that time doesn't exist, that there are dual parallel worlds and existences. Does this perhaps create a framework for thinking about that worlds outside of time where we're seeing what we see in a linear time chronological scheme could actually just be a map, a fractal map of parallel existences.
I think there's a lot of truth to that. And I think fractals, the way that the whole contains smaller copies of itself, similar copies, not identical, and the way that the same kind of order and patterns resonates throughout this entire structure that we live in is called the universe. I think that has definitely metaphysical aspects as well.
The images themselves seem to imply that, and maybe I'm overreaching because I
don't think so.
There's a gut level suspicion when you see these. I just can't avoid that, and at least how I think about things.
That's why I'm into fractals. I mean, the gut level feel that you talk about. I mean, for me, it just hit me the first time I saw it because it was this mystery.
Yes,
there's this deep sense of mystery and this sense of overarching order to them that I cannot explain, and nobody can. They're just
but
there.
It's not arbitrary.
It's not, definitely not.
It's not this. Yeah, I mean, anything that with infinite complexity you would think would be impossible to comprehend. Yet any glance at these, and it's very organized.
It is.
It's very disciplined.
It's almost the opposite to random noise.
Yes, exactly.
Random noise is just random noise. There's nothing in there for there is interesting to us. There's nothing to it. We might see patterns because we tend to create patterns, even when there aren't any. But fractals shows us that there's an underlying pattern behind everything.
With astonishingly little noise.
Yeah.
I mean, despite the complexity, there's almost no noise, at least when framed, the parts of it that we tend to focus on.
Fractals can be very, very noisy, but that's all a matter of how much computational power that you throw at them.
Oh.
Some fractals are very noisy.
And that just means it's not completely calculated?
Exactly. So you just calculate and calculate and calculate, and it starts to resolve itself
Always?
into something. Usually, yeah.
Wow.
Or I think always, as far as I know.
Okay, interesting. So is this a conceptual framework or is this a practical tool? I mean, clearly it is a conceptual framework in the way that we're talking about it, in the way it captures our imagination and makes us rethink previous assumptions about the world. But can it be a practical tool? I know you had once mentioned it had predictive capabilities. How would this be leveraged as something to be applied?
It definitely can, and that's where sort of the similarity to fractal patterns to actual nature come into play. One very famous example is the coastline of England, or the coastline of Britain actually, that Benno Mandelbrot popularized. And if you're standing on the beach and you look down on the water meeting the land, that's not a straight line. It's a very complicated line,
right?
Not lots of little wriggly parts.
Infinite nooks and
infinite nooks and crannies.
Yeah.
And the closer you look, the more you will see.
Okay.
And if you zoom out to space and look at the very same coastline you're standing on from space, you will look the same way. It will look very jiggly and with all these little nooks and crannies. But it cannot be measured using traditional means. It's impossible to measure a coastline using normal geometry.
Okay, you mean
because
straight lines?
It's arbitrary. I mean, if you measure the
you'd have to trace all those nooks and zigzags.
So if you use a ruler that is 10 miles long,
yes,
and you measure England, you will get
10-mile increments with a straight line.
But if you use a 1 micron long ruler, the coastline is going to be infinitely long.
Because you'll get every little curve. Although even at that length, there are still sub-micron curves beneath that. But it'll be more precise and therefore a longer measurement than the 10-mile ruler.
Exactly. So, I mean, this complexity never ends. It's all an arbitrary decision. Where do we stop looking? Is this good enough? And fractals can give us a much, much better sense of how things work than traditional mathematics can. For instance, in predicting financial systems.
Okay, so how would that work?
Financial systems are very difficult to predict, just like weather, because it's chaotic.
Yeah.
And it has...
Although not random, it's still based on human judgments.
It is. It's just that all the factors that are involved, there's so many factors, there's so many decisions, so many wills.
It's so vast.
Yeah, and it's depending on so many components. But fractals are actually able to predict the outcome of these much, much better. Because it doesn't look like this.
So do they first try to map existing behavior? I mean, in the way that an econometric regression model might? or is it more of a visual map, or how would it sort of study past behavior to mimic a forward-looking fractal?
Basically, you can just look at previous behavior and see how, and you start looking at different systems to start creating something that maps it as closely as possible. And once you get that, you can use it to predict it better. Just like weather, you can.
Okay, so you just understand the patterns better.
Yeah, you understand them better.
Okay, the historical as well as by understanding the historical patterns better, you'll understand the future probabilities better.
Definitely. I mean, just like weather forecasts have improved
Okay.
a lot since fractals were discovered.
Oh, is that right? Okay.
Fractals are used all the time.
So how would a fractal be applied to a weather forecast?
It's just using algorithms that more closely matches the behavior of weather systems.
Okay.
So we're able to, instead of not knowing what's going to happen tomorrow, we're actually able to predict weather to some extent next week or maybe even a couple of weeks further. But that's sort of where it ends. But there's a lot of stuff that we can predict using.
Okay, that's extraordinary. So how are fractals created? Like, how do you make fractals? You make fractals. You're coming out with a book on fractals. How do you construct them? How do you design them?
It's a pretty weird, complex. I mean, basically, you take this tiny little algorithm and you let it feed back on itself, and you start creating these really strange patterns. And since it's just mathematics, you dive into it, you zoom into it, it creates itself over.
But you're not using a calculator.
No.
What tools, what programs create these? What tools do you use on the computer?
I use many different fractal applications,
Okay.
but one that is my favorite, one of my favorites is called Mandelbrot 3D, which actually means calculating the Mandelbrot set in 3 dimensions.
But it can be done for more than just that one fractal.
I can mix and match any number of fractals.
Now that's interesting too. So you have independent fractals.
Yep.
Then the idea of combining fractals. You're taking two of these worlds that are infinitely complex but seem to have a lot of designed elements and organized coherence to them. But what happens when you combine two different ones? Does it go chaotic, more chaotic? Does it become, it's hard to believe it would become more organized.
Let's just say that it becomes increasingly weird,
but still discernible and not just noisy.
Some of them are. Some of them
Okay.
you will see nothing basically
Okay.
but noise. So it's a lot of trial and error, combining different formulas and approaching them in different ways. And each formula has, sometimes hundreds of different settings. So you can tweak it.
And this is in the Mandelbrot
Yeah.
3D program.
You tweak it in
designing.
a number of ways, so that the number of times you iterate it, as it's called.
But fundamentally, it's just taking that formula and extrapolating it in the
Yeah.
directions you steer it using the program.
Mainly, I control things like scale and rotation and complexity and stuff like that. But
Okay.
the underlying structure is just what it is.
Wow.
But when I combine two of them, you get them sort of start growing into each other almost organically.
Okay.
And then I can throw maybe a third one in.
Now, are you controlling the degree of each one? What levers do you have to control this mix?
I can control a fair number of those aspects, like scale and rotation and
Okay.
level of complexity and stuff like that, and how they interact with each other. But it's a bit similar to nature photography in a sense. That if I go out in nature, I haven't created nature,
Right.
obviously, but I do choose where to go. I choose the light. I choose how I frame the image.
You compose and you look for
Exactly.
something that resonates with you.
So that's basically what you do with 3-dimensional fractals too,
Okay.
and 2-dimensional as well. I mean, you choose where to go. You wander in this forest of infinite complexity, and you stop at this glade and you see, oh, well, that looks pretty cool.
Wow.
And maybe that looks even better tonight, so I'll hang around.
And when you combine two, does then the math get really complex, or does it still remain pretty simple in terms of the fundamental
Yeah.
algorithm?
It's pretty simple.
That's what
It's
amazes
the
me the
outcome
most.
that
That
is
such a
infinitely
simple
complex.
thing can create such, a literally infinite thing. Not even vast, infinite.
It is actually infinite.
Which is just impossible, really, to understand what infinite means. So it's bigger than the universe. It has no definition to its size. How much of we look at these really stunningly beautiful fractals. How much of that is artistic interpretation in terms of coloring or aesthetic elements, and how much of that is the actual fundamental mathematics?
You're seeing the actual fundamental mathematics. It's nothing that is obscuring them. At least not the way that I do fractals. I tend to keep them clean so they're still what they are. I don't do any post in fractals. I may apply some fog to create an illusion of scale or depth. But that's also a function of the fractal itself.
The fog is a function of the fractal.
It's a distance estimated fog.
Okay.
So it calculates the distance within the fractal to give it mass, basically.
How would we look at a fractal with more than 3 dimensions? Or how would we interpret that?
We couldn't.
We couldn't, okay.
but I mean, I worked with many multidimensional fractals, but they're projected back into 3-dimensional space.
So you're seeing them, how do you know that there are 4 or 5 dimensions to it then? If you can't see it.
That's in the mathematics. I mean, in mathematics, you can have a hypercube, for instance. You can draw a cube that is 16-dimensional. But it's very hard for us to comprehend it because we can't think in more dimensions than 3 plus time, which is 4. But using fractals, I can easily mix 7-dimensional fractals or what have you.
Well, so you know it has 7, you just can't see.
Yeah, and I can manipulate properties of the 7-dimensional fractals, but the way I see it on my screen, that's a 3-dimensional fractal showing itself on my 2-dimensional computer screen.
So in the same way that a 2-dimensional being looking at a 3-dimensional object, say a sphere came through a 2-dimensional world, you just see a circle get bigger and smaller. In the same way you see that limited view of this fractal.
Let's say it's a bit like an iceberg. You see a part of it sticking up, above our level of complexity, which is 3-dimensional, but you don't really see what's underneath, which is the actual thing, which is much more complicated.
The rest of the iceberg. So what's the next phase of exploring fractals? So we've come a long way very quickly since the 80s. What's the next frontier of understanding and applying fractals?
There's going to be a lot of very cool things happening with AI and independent systems. Fractals growing themselves, for instance, and finding, just like we use evolving mathematics like machine learning to create better and better solutions for a finite set of problems, which is actually very good for, at least for some of these things.
So you think an AI would figure out better, faster, where to look and how to apply a fractal?
We will see fractals that are independently created by computers that will generate immense worlds that we can step into.
Meaning new algorithms or just finding more interesting parts of existing ones that we know of?
There are probably an infinite number of fractals as well.
Okay.
We have found a couple of hundred of them, and we use regularly. I use at least 20 or 30 different fractals, but I could use any number.
This is the phenomenon of mathematics. Is that fair to say?
Yeah.
So when we find one, we're just discovering a simple formula that has these expansive properties. Okay. We've also talked about fractals used in storytelling. So more and more we're seeing them in specifically Marvel movies.
Yeah. Pretty early on, we could see that fractals were really good at generating terrain, for instance. And they also mimic natural phenomena. Whether they explain them or mimic them is open to interpretation, but they really produce results that look very realistic.
So which is why you see 3D software programs that develop 3D graphics using fractal engines to create textures.
All of them do that. And
all of them do. Okay.
Every single movie that you go to these days pretty much uses fractals for a lot of things that you see. I mean, the more spectacular they are, usually the more true that is. For instance, you go see Pirates of the Caribbean movie, and the water will be fractals, the clouds will be fractals, the mountains will be fractals, the islands that you see will likely be, at least some of them are fractals. So it's that leads us into the question of what is real. Not only how we look at it, but what is actually real. What you're seeing depicted, is that real? Or did you just decide that it was real because you wanted a cool experience?
Some movies are explicitly flaunting their fractalness.
Yeah.
Like some that we've talked about would be Doctor Strange and Guardians of the Galaxy 2.
Yeah. They use a lot of Mandelbrot fractals in both of those movies.
And they're using them to convey the sense of mind-blowing abstraction, this sort of supernatural experience.
It's easy to use them in movies because they have this sense, like you were talking about before, that they have this sort of sense of gut feel mystery, right? They project that feel.
These particular storytelling uses of fractals are really just tapping into that primal thing that you and I first got excited about when we first saw them. They're not really getting into the ideas behind fractals. I mean, I haven't seen any stories that would suggest a more, psychological or philosophical connection to what fractals mean. It's more of a visual spectacle.
I think
is that fair to say?
I think so. But it's a very interesting question. I think, they connect with us on a primal level of some kind, just like fire does. So you use fire in a movie and we get a specific reaction. You see somebody crying in a movie, you get a specific reaction. See somebody's frightened. And if you see a fractal, you get this sort of sense of mystery or this otherworldliness that, in a sense, also feels worldly. You get this weird mix of signals that we really can't interpret. But I think one movie that really did a great job of sort of showing the philosophical dimensions of fractals was actually Interstellar. Maze of parallel realities. You can open any number of doors.
The end of Interstellar.
Yeah. And they're not identical. You get a sense that they will lead to something that is slightly different, that has a different outcome. And maybe that's how life works.
You're right. Actually, that is a very philosophical approach. That was implying that different potential futures and different potential pasts were represented in the same way the Mandelbrot Set had all these very similar but not identical repeating patterns, that these different doors into different pasts and different futures were like that. We're similarly self-similar but not identical.
Because they're based on a set of rules. Yeah, we don't know the rules yet, but we can see that there are rules. And we can also see that fractals give us a better sense of what the rules are. So fractals are part of the rule book of the universe. We're learning. And that's the cool thing about it. Like Stephen Hawking said that the universe itself might be part of the crest of a fractal wave.
Wow.
That's Stephen Hawking.
Yeah.
So let him explain it. He refrained from even trying to do so.
Oh, okay.
Because it's so complicated.
So you're telling me not to follow up with digging deeper on that?
I suggest you should.
Fair enough.
Maybe
with Stephen.
If you want to change careers.
Take it up with Stephen.
Yeah, but I think it's a beautiful thing, that a person like Stephen Hawking sees complexity that is so overwhelming and still so enticing to him on an intellectual level that he refrains from pursuing it.
Is it typical for scientists at that high level to see something substantive in fractals?
Yeah.
Is this a common discussion in those circles?
I would say so. I mean, I'm not a mathematician myself, but I've met a fair number of them, and fractals tend to pop up in the discussion.
They're as intrigued as we are?
Oh, very much so.
Even more so,
because they can't explain it either. They can have a much better understanding.
It's a challenge in a way to them.
Yeah, and
do they try to?
The inner workings of...
How could they not try? It seems like it would be begging for them to take on this challenge.
There are a lot of people trying to figure out the universe, but it gets very complicated.
I imagine.
What I'm doing is enjoying sort of the fruits that fall from that tree, right?
Right.
And
although you're pretty deep into it as well, and you come from a deep technical background.
Yeah, I do. Yeah.
So you can have conversations with these people, and
to a certain level, yes.
Do they feel that this is the tip of an iceberg, and that the rest of the iceberg potentially likely reveals something fundamental about the universe?
I think a lot of people have that feeling.
People at high levels in scientific circles?
Yeah, I mean, we all share, that gut feeling that there is something very substantial here. That there's this cosmic rule book that we're looking at on some level. We don't know exactly how it works. But we're drawn to it like moths to a flame, in a sense. And that flame has sucked me in for a very long time.
From the very first moment I saw them.
And it sucked you in too, right?
It sucked me in as well, and clearly a lot of other people.
And we really can, none of us can say why that is.
Right.
We just...
But the same way that fire is mesmerizing and many other things.
Yeah.
You're also working deep in the virtual reality and augmented reality space. It seems that virtual space in a VR headset would be the ultimate way to experience fractals.
I would totally agree about that. And so I've been doing VR-based fractals for a few years now. And the very first time I did it, I generated a 3-dimensional fractals in 360, which is easy enough to do. But when I stepped into it, I saw it in a completely different way. It was, first of all, it was way bigger than I even could comprehend.
Just the scale to begin with, yeah.
The scale was immense. And I was looking at something, and I realized that if I would fall down this infinite crack that I'm seeing below me, I would fall literally until the end of the universe, because it doesn't stop. And I can zoom into it forever. I can fly through fractals. I do a lot of fractal animations in VR. And it's really, even to me, I've been doing fractals for 20 years and more.
Right, in Fractal, you can apply this with no seams, just perfectly wrap it around
the
VR experience.
No cameras.
It calculates itself as you go.
Perfect stitching.
It's almost like scuba diving. You could explore it in a visceral, virtual.
It's actually pretty similar to scuba diving.
Like scuba diving, potentially, you're exploring things that nobody has ever seen. It's not like somebody had to make it in
No.
like with a game engine,
Yeah.
typical or Maya application, where somebody made it and then you discover what they made. You're discovering something that nobody has ever experienced because you went in a direction that caused the formula to calculate the creation of that environment.
That's a very nice way of saying it. And even two-dimensional fractals, I have no idea what I will see when I zoom in. And in three-dimensional fractals, especially in VR, it's even more this sort of fundamental feeling of exploring because you're actually physically exploring it. You fly through it and you see a little nook and cranny that looks a little different than the other ones.
Yeah.
So you go into that and you find yourself in this immense cavern full of stuff that you've never seen before.
Right.
And you can be 100% certain that no human eye has ever seen that before, ever. And nobody probably ever will because you will not end up in the same spots because it's infinite. Just a few mouse clicks away, you will see stuff that nobody has ever seen.
That's extraordinary. I sometimes ask whether people with your level of experience in VR, AR development, if you can envision a time when virtual space will be indistinguishable from reality. So first of all, I'm just curious whether you see that as a viable place that we will arrive at.
Oh, definitely, because so much of what we see being the actual world has to do with fractals. For instance, the structure of our skin, or the structure of this table, or the way the glass reflects light. All of those we can mimic with fractal algorithms in a way that resembles reality very, very closely, to the extent that we cannot tell the difference. Classical example of that is generating terrain in 3D movies, for instance. We cannot see whether it's real or not. It's impossible for us to tell because it mimics it so closely.
So already you're not able to distinguish between something manufactured and something natural.
So I think having fractal engines auto-generating entire worlds, we can actually do that right now.
Well, that's actually what prompted me to bring this question up with you, is that it seems like the closest thing to that exists today is this exploration of fractals in a virtual reality headset.
There is.
It's the only experience I've had where it feels like the world is endless in the headset you're in, because it literally is.
It actually is, yeah.
Do you see the world we're heading into with all these virtual worlds and artificial intelligence and robotics? Are you optimistic or are you concerned?
That's a double-edged sword, right? Because when people are involved, they tend to mess up things, right? And we have a capacity for good and for evil. So I don't think it really matters what tools we have on a moral plane.
The consequences seem to be higher.
If I have a stick, I can beat you with it or I can help you with it. So it doesn't really matter if that's a supercomputer.
Okay, well, except that the consequences, the stakes are higher.
On some levels, yeah, but I mean, death is pretty final, however it comes to
But
it.
a species annihilation is more extreme than a death.
Yeah, but I mean, genocide has been around for a very long time.
But that's
Ask
not,
the
that's
Neanderthals.
not, that's not the elimination of a species. Not that I'm saying that's where we're going to end up, but I'm just saying the scale of modern weaponry, future weaponry, of accidents happening, just seem, I mean, they're existential threats. They have the potential to be.
Even if we're really good at coming up with weapons, we're extremely good at that, and we're extremely good at killing each other. But we're also very good at coming up with counter defenses. And we're also very good at finding medical cures, for instance. We can extend our lifetimes, we can extend our quality of life, at least. The Industrial Revolution has led to a level of human existence that we have never seen before. The world is going in the right direction very rapidly. We have less and less number of poor people. We have less and less starvation. We have less and less disease. We have stopped the population explosion.
Even declines in violence.
Yeah. So, and there's all of these things. And I think just being able to have a more interconnected world where people are able to exchange thoughts at the speed of light, we've never had that before.
Right.
We're not sure how that is changing society. We can see that dictatorships are trying to put a stop to that as much as they can. We have Russia and China.
They seem to be fighting against history, is the sense I
They're
get.
fighting against people's natural tendency to connect with other people and learn from them, I would say, which is not in a dictator's best interest. So I think technology is actually the best thing that we've ever had.
Fantastic. Awesome. Well, thank you so much. This is
Thank
really
you.
insightful stuff. Where
It's
can
been a
people
pleasure.
learn more about what you're up to and what you're working on?
They can go on to, I have a company called Pacific Virtual Reality, and they could go on to that website and see some examples of fractals, both three-dimensional, two-dimensional, and also some VR and AR projects.
What's the URL for that?
pacificvirtualreality.com.
Okay, we'll link to that below.
On Facebook called Fractal Frontiers. That's
Okay.
one word.
That's a great site. It links to your fractal in a way, your fractals in a way that people can explore on a computer screen.
Yeah.
Fantastic.
Awesome.
Great. Well, thank you so much. Really appreciate
you,
you
August.
sharing your thoughts. And thank you guys for watching. If you have any thoughts or comments, leave them below. If you like this kind of conversation, hit the subscribe button, and I'll see you next time. Thanks.